Welcome back to Press Coverage. This is Theo Gremminger, and I'm joined today for episode number 3 with Josh Larky, who's a good friend of mine. We were talking about in the pre-show. This is going to sound pretty good because Josh and I are on like a dozen podcasts together at this point. Josh, I was very fortunate to have Josh on during his rise in fantasy as an analyst when he came on the GOAT District several times. And then Josh just kept kind of getting bigger and bigger. GOAT District got bigger as well, but not to the level that Josh did. But Josh has always been really generous with his time, really generous with his takes. And I always enjoy talking to Josh because I think, Josh, you're willing to take a stand on things, and you also think outside of the box. I think you hate groupthink mentality in fantasy, and I think you're always looking for edges. And I think that's the way that I look at myself. And that's really the premise of this podcast. If you didn't catch the first 2 ones, highly recommend listening to Adam Levitan and Sigmund Bloom. But I want to ask guests for sharp takes on things. I want actionable information. And Josh, this podcast really started because I think it's getting more difficult to find edges in fantasy football in the information age. So welcome to the show. And how are you doing today?
Theo, thank you for having me. Doing well. And I think one thing you said that I took personally in a very good way was when you discussed how I don't like groupthink. And I feel like that's one of the remaining edges in this space, is that a lot of people really don't like going against the grain. There's the rise of these huge season-long fantasy football tournaments, best ball tournaments. So I'm thinking, okay, we're really enjoying these formats where there's tens, hundreds of thousands of people in the same draft or in the same tournament. And yet we're all trying to think about stuff very, very similarly. We're trying to copy the analysts we love and do exactly what they're doing. And it feels like now is as good a time as ever to kind of create your takes in a vacuum and then start to battle test them outside of that and figure out which of your personal homegrown takes are the ones that you want to stick with. Because if you don't have that aspect into your analysis, you'll probably draft some really good teams, but they will not be quite different or good enough to really separate yourself if they're starting to look just like dozens, hundreds of other people's.
Yes, I think that's a really, really great way of looking at things. We had Hayden Winks the other day on First Class Fantasy with Billy Muzio and I think it's kind of like the underdog effect. You see underdog grow, and it's kind of created like this environment where it's wide receivers getting steamed up, quarterbacks getting steamed up. You're seeing it across all sorts of fantasy platforms. And then, Josh, we also have the little fun aspect that DeAndre Hopkins and Dalvin Cook, 2 guys that we would imagine finish inside of the wide receiver 2 and RB2 line, are still out there ready to kind of ruin some of our valuations. So I think, being willing to kind of think outside the box, be bold and be aggressive with your builds is a very good recommendation, not only for best ball, but also for redraft. Are you starting to see, you talk about copycat builds? Are you being more willing to kind of reach around at ADP, not necessarily wildly, but calculated reaches to try to make yourself look different?
Yeah, I'll definitely do some of that. I actually think the perfect ways to start to experiment with that type of drafting is a lot of these kind of flash in the pan underdog tournaments like the Puppy or the Chihuahua. I'm probably forgetting some other cute little dog names, but essentially these tournaments the Pomeranian, there we go. I knew I was forgetting a big one. These tournaments that we know are going to fill within anywhere from 2 to 7 days. If you're just drafting purely off of ADP, everyone's team's going to look the same. It's not best ball mania where it's open for like 3.5, 4 months. So you have months and months for players to rise and fall, strategies to get really exciting, and then they start to taper off. No, it's just rapid fire. This is a tournament. Everyone has the same ADP. ADPs are not moving more than 1 or 2 spots over that few day period. And I think that those are the perfect little incubators to try this, because everyone is using identical ADP that will not change. They're drafting at as well the same exact time of year.
Yeah, I think that's a great one. And I just wanted to give you a quick shout out. You've put together a really nice team over at the 33rd team, the team at the 33rd team. But you've also put together some unique minds in the space, and I think you're covering a lot of topics. What sort of interesting things do you guys have cooking at 33rd Team for the rest of the summer?
We'll have a lot of fantasy content coming soon, kind of breaking down what it takes to be an elite fantasy option at different positions, which players are still being mispriced either too high or too low based on some of those qualifications, analyzing more in depth how rookies score at different positions and where to find value pockets there. And I think there's still a lot of people that aren't incorporating the value of play-by-play data into their analysis. So I'll have some stuff like that, fantasy related, coming out over the next few weeks. And then other team members that I'll shout out. Ryan Reynolds, my co-host for our flagship fantasy and betting podcast. He has a ton of great content coming out soon. He'll have offensive line rankings coming out shortly. The man watches every snap of every game, sometimes twice. So he's someone that I really trust. I think if there was anyone that could just tomorrow show up and be the head of scouting for an NFL team, someone like Ryan would definitely be my first pick there. And then Jordan Vanek, our head of DFS, has some really, really unique receiver research coming out soon. Sort of like the name of the show, Press Coverage, looking at receivers against different coverage schemes and trying to find edges there based on the way that certain receivers perform against different coverages. Some coverages are harder for receivers to perform against than others. So trying to analyze the guys that have shown elite potential in tougher situations are often the guys that are going to break out in future seasons. So a lot to come on the site. And as of right now, everything on the 3013.com is free. So if you're a player profiler sub, you don't have to worry about picking between the two and who should I choose, who gets my money. Give Player Profiler your money and check out the 33rdteam.com as well.
Thank you, Josh. And Josh, you were very, very successful at Player Profiler, and Josh's work is still up and running. If you want to read Josh's articles at Player Profiler, you can find them. There is an evergreen stacking article that exists, but your new articles at the 33rd Team are amazing as well. I believe you dropped some running back tiers, or was it running back rankings recently?
Those were just running back rankings. I'll have more in-depth rankings for running backs with tiers, but the same style that I've been doing so far. You can see my pinned tweet. It's right there. Breaking down with 1 to 2 paragraphs per running back, kind of analyzing how I see them, what their outlook is like for 2023 in my eyes. And I think that's always very helpful to see how an analyst views players, because you can agree, disagree, but at least I'm giving you a foundation to either agree with, poke holes in, add on to, however you want to handle it. So I think that's always important, just to be able to understand what's behind these takes, because ultimately you have a lot of takes, I have a lot of takes, but I think what's more important is what leads you to that position.
Yeah, I know. I love it because you're giving written context. You're not just providing a ranking. I thought that was just great. Anyway, we're going to get into it. We're going to talk about a lot of stuff today. We're going to look at ADP values. We're going to look at finding upside. We're going to talk about the new dead zone. But first, we're going to hear a read from our friends at Rival Fantasy.
Oh, baseball season's heating up. It's all about baseball right now. Baseball. Yeah, baseball is the most exploitable of the sports, especially on Rival Fantasy, rivalfantasy.com. Go there now. They have the fantasy book where you can take over under a certain number of fantasy points, and they have challenges where you can take player X or player Y. I get great pleasure out of fading Mike Trout into oblivion. And then don't forget about fantasy bingo, where you can say, okay, I think Acuna's going to steal a base today. I think that Freddie Freeman's going to have 2 hits based on the matchup. The lefty-righty and the pitcher quality matchups that you could exploit are unlike any other sport. Go to rivalfantasy.com. Use the promo code PLAYER. They refund any losses up to $50, and they are a great supporter of Player Profiler. Everything we do, this show in particular, is only possible because of Rival. Rivalfantasy.com. The promo code is PLAYER.
Ad bumpers like a boss right there, Josh. That's just pro stuff right there.
That was good. As a former baseball analytics guy, I appreciate baseball being snuck into this one.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people don't know this is not a Josh Larky biography story, but you have a very cool baseball background. Why don't you quickly share that with people? Because I believe it was 2 years with Major League Baseball teams.
Yeah, I got my start professionally in Major League Baseball. I worked for both the Detroit Tigers and the San Diego Padres for the 2018 and 2019 seasons. So kind of a unique way to ultimately break into the sports industry and eventually going from the team side to the gambling side. So I think I have a lot of good experience that a lot of other people don't have. And I try and rely on that, because what that doesn't mean is that I do not have this storied fantasy career spanning a decade plus. So that's an obvious disadvantage. The obvious advantage is that it's kind of a unique career path. So that's why I always stress to people to rely on your own personal knowledge base. Because if I tried to act like I'd been playing fantasy for decades and decades, and that's where my takes were rooted, I would be fraudulent, and that wouldn't even be my own personal edge, because that's just not true. So it's very important for people to kind of capitalize on whatever your educational, professional, hobbyist background is.
Yeah, I think it's very cool how coding and obviously the statistical nature of baseball kind of come into play with the way you look at fantasy. And I think that's you have a real sense of self in kind of the way you see the game. And I think that's really showing in your work. And I wanted to quickly start out, it's off the show sheet, but one question that I've been asking everyone, pretty much everybody that's come on this show, as well as my first class fantasy guest with Billy Muzio, is you do a lot of rankings and you do take a lot of pride in that and you go deep with it. Which player, if you could know their final stats among any player in football, who would it be? Maybe the player that's got the widest range of outcomes, maybe the player that was just the most difficult for you to kind of project for this season.
Oh God. That is actually a great question. The first name that popped in my head was Rachaad White.
Build on that one.
So we'll touch on the running back dead zone more later, but he feels like a dead zone running back in pretty much every way except place on the depth chart. This was someone who had fine but not great draft capital going round 3 to the Buccaneers last year. Someone who had some great counting stats, but they're pretty deceiving because of the team situation. So he had over 50 receptions as a rookie running back. Oh my God. That's one of the best numbers we've ever seen. Until you realize that he was actually by far second on the team in running back receptions. Fournette had over 70. Rachaad White hit a 50% snap share in just one of the final 4 games of the season. So he sort of captured a role, but not actually a big role. And it's Baker Mayfield. So it's a big quarterback downgrade, a big play volume downgrade from Tom Brady. And there's also really good receivers there. We got Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, generally good receivers, hint at a lower running back target share because the quarterback's going to throw to the good receivers. I really just don't know what to make of this, but I've been a little below consensus on Rachaad White just because I don't believe in the player's talent and I don't want to bet on this Buccaneers offense. But at the same time, it's a pretty putrid depth chart. I actually don't even know who the running back 2 is there. Is it Keyshawn Vaughn? Is it Sean Tucker? Is it another guy that I'm not aware of who's on that depth chart? I could totally see Rachaad White being anywhere from Mike Davis, who we all remember on the Falcons from a couple years ago, who did nothing and was like the quintessential dead zone back, all the way up to going, well, you know what? He kind of did it again. There's 65 catches on a stinky offense. And in PPR leagues, he's the RB14. So I'm leaning him right now.
That's a really interesting one. I've gotten Kadarius Toney from a couple people. I've
That's
gotten
a good one too.
Anthony Richardson. I've always said Deshaun Watson just because it's kind of like is this the cheat code at quarterback where I can get a potentially top 3 quarterback at like quarterback 9 pricing, or is Deshaun Watson going to be closer to where he was last year where he's a back end QB2? So I think he's like a wide range guy. It's a really great mental process. And I really like your answer with Rachaad White. You're definitely the first person that said Rachaad White. And I'll say he's in an eye of the beholder situation. Like some people love it, some people don't. But you have to love the fact that the backs behind them are complete garbage.
They're so terrible.
That helps out a lot. I'll throw Chase Edmonds' name in there if you want to get really, really grimy.
That's right.
Chase Edmonds, who they brought in as well. So that's great for Rachaad White. So anyway, I want to start out. One edge that we're seeing here is whether you talk to high stakes drafters for redraft, whether you talk to people just looking at ADP, or whether you talk to people that are doing a ton of underdog drafts. A lot of people come away with the realization that I love drafting from the 1-2 turn. I love being in the back half of the first round because there's so much value in that early second round. And also you have a perception of a flat tier. That's Great. But what is the way that we should maximize, the advantage of having, potentially the 12th pick, the 11th pick? Let's take this for a redraft context, Josh. And I'll tell you this, I'm in a FFPC slow main event right now. And I went with Amon-Ra St. Brown and AJ Brown. I went wide receiver there. I think a lot of people are going wide receiver. And I've also seen some RB people here. Is this the way you approach it? Are you going to double down on a position? Are you looking at balance? What would be your approach from the back?
I generally try and double down on a position. I think my favorite is 2 receivers. There's kind of a nice collection of 5 guys that are all pretty young with tons of upside. We have CeeDee Lamb, Jalen Waddle, AJ Brown, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and Garrett Wilson. And those 5, it's pretty easy to see all these guys absolutely smashing in fantasy. And I'd say that the floors for all 5 of them are quite high as well, where even if they have a season where they don't live up to ADP, they're close. It's pretty hard to see these guys being healthy and putting up like 750 yards. I don't really see how that happens. I think these guys are all 1,000+ yard receivers. I think running back is interesting. I've done it a couple times when I can get Bijan Robinson and Saquon Barkley. I think that's a pretty nice combo where you could potentially get the 2 touch leaders at running back who also have pass game roles. But in general, I think the receiver start is best, because if you go running back, you're not picking receivers until 36, 37. And that's a pretty long time to wait, considering how many receivers go early. You're essentially missing out on like a tier and a half, 2, 3, 4 tiers, depending on how aggressively you want to group these guys together. So I've generally thought the 2 receivers is the best way to do it. And that ultimately the guys who go, I want to be balanced, 1 running back, 1 receiver, you are not putting pressure on anybody, because everyone else looks at that team. They go, wow, that's a balanced team. It's much better to try and kick off a receiver run or kick off a running back run once you've already gotten 2 studs at that position.
I think that you hit the nail on the head with that. I think it's a game theory perspective where you're controlling the back half of the board rather than just trying to be balanced. And also, if I start running back, wide receiver, it can work, but I'm also kind of punching up. I'm not only chasing 1 position, I'm chasing 2. Whereas my thought with an AJ Brown, Amon-Ra St. Brown start, and just to give it a little context, Saquon had been selected, Bijan had been selected. Saquon's kind of a flip a coin whether he'll be there at the turn, but Bijan's always pretty much gone in these FFPC drafts. But my thought process was I'm going to like the running backs a little bit more at 36, 37 than I would the wide receivers. And also, I'm kind of fluid where I could take another wide receiver at 36, 37. Whereas if I went running back, I'd almost be pot committed to taking wide receiver because of the scarcity of the position. So I think it's interesting. I like what you said. I'll throw out one scenario to you. In a tight end premium format like FFPC, do you think that there's any weight in pushing up like a Mark Andrews, like a potential tight end 2 overall to that level? Like he goes mid-second. It just feels like you're losing an edge if you do that.
We'll talk about him more later, but all I'll say right now is I agree with what you just said.
Okay, awesome. Well, I want to keep this first round discussion going. Another polarizing topic and conversation that we're seeing in the high stakes streets is Austin Ekeler versus Bijan Robinson. I personally think as the summer moves along, you're going to see a lot more Christian McCaffrey versus Bijan Robinson conversations, for better or for worse, as his ADP steams up. But right now, when you look at FFPC ADP, when you look at underdog ADP, these guys are the running back 2 and the running back 3. Where do you stand on this? I know that you have, you have some confidence in the Chargers offense, as do I, as does Billy Muzio, as do a lot of people. But with a changing of the guard at offensive coordinator with Kellen Moore, is there a chance that Austin Ekeler comes down and is like an 80 reception guy? And does that skew your thought process with this at all?
Yeah, right now I'm leaning Bijan. I wouldn't say that there's ultra high confidence that he's going to finish above Ekeler, but I'll kind of explain some concerns with Ekeler. So he had the target spike last season. He had over 100 receptions for the first time in his career. And you look at the depth chart and the injuries, and it makes sense. It's Justin Herbert. It's obviously going to be a high pass volume offense, a fast pace of play. Keenan Allen goes down for half the season due to injury. Mike Williams misses several games as well. Josh Palmer, when he's the wide receiver 1 in an offense, Of course, your receivers won't be getting as much separation as you hope, and you're going to be checking the ball down to a very good pass-catching running back in Ekeler. Now they have not just Allen and Williams returning and healthy currently. You have Quentin Johnston, who they selected in the first round. Josh Palmer is still there. Gerald Everett's a competent pass-catching tight end. Donald Parham generally gets some type of work whenever he's on the field. And as we mentioned, the new offensive coordinator, Kellen Moore, came from Dallas. Always two-back committees. Obviously, if you have Zeke and Pollard, two pretty excellent running backs, you're going to have these committees. But it does make me a little nervous that no matter which one was performing better, they always stuck to that. And it's almost like they realized that both players played better when their touches were limited. Ekeler himself has always been vocal about limiting his touches. I'm not sure if he gets all the goal line carries. When I spoke to Austin Ekeler a few years ago at Player Profiler, when we partnered with the Austin Ekeler Foundation, Austin himself discussed how he doesn't even like goal line carries that much because of the punishment that it puts onto your body. 200 carries, 100 plus targets in pretty much back-to-back seasons. That's a lot of work for this 195 to 200 pound running back. And I love the Chargers offense. That's why I'm not going to be like, oh, let's fade Ekeler. Let's bet against Ekeler. I just think Bijan has fewer questions. We've got that great Falcons O-line. Their schedule is so cake. They're just going to be able to run all over opponents. I think they have a kind of this sneaky chance to be a top 10 scoring offense due to the schedule, due to that offensive line, due to the weapons that they have. And it's tough to see him not getting 300 to 350 touches, given how they're going to structure the run and pass rates in this offense. I don't think Bijan's going to have as many targets as Ekeler, but I think the touchdowns and the raw volume make me lean Bijan.
I'm with you. And I think that it's a tough, for some drafters I need to see it types. And with Bijan, you're never going to get that opportunity because he's going to be so good out the gate. And I also think that historically, seventh-year running back has not been a great bet. We see the guys fall off at the position. And even if they don't fall off, it's just odd to see them finish number one overall. We only need to go back to Saquon Barkley to see a rookie running back finishing one overall at the position. And we also saw Najee Harris get inside of the top three. So I think that Bijan's just a better bet right now. And like you said, there's a chance for Austin Ekeler, if he loses some touchdowns and potentially also some receptions, he could move down to running back 6 overall level. Bijan, I think, is actually a very safe pick because they're going to be so focused on him. Want to follow up to one thing you said, though. You mentioned you think Atlanta could be a sneaky good scoring offense. I guess that would have them going back to 2021 Arthur Smith passing attempts versus last year. Do you see one of the two? We don't need to talk about Kyle Pitts, but do you see just in general betting on one of the big two pass catchers in Atlanta? Is that something we should be doing as well if this offense is one you're betting on beating expectations?
I'm actually going to discuss Atlanta pretty in depth on a few 33rd team podcasts. So I don't want to spoil all the research there, but essentially Pitts and London look very similar to me. I think the guy who's tight end eligible goes later in non-tight end premium fantasy drafts. In tight end premium, they seem to go pretty similarly. I am generally inclined to root for the guy that plays tight end if they look similar enough. So I'll be diagnosing how these guys look very similar and how it's kind of tough to have Bijan, London, and Pitts all hit in this offense. It's probably going to be one, if not two. And I actually think London has the thinnest case to hit. So I'll be discussing why his target share is actually quite deceiving as a pound the table stat for why this guy is about to explode in year 2.
Well, I think I can get inside of Josh's head here, and I'm going to go ahead and think that one of your takeaways is Kyle Pitts has more chance for red zone targets and deep targets, and I think that their targets in total could be a little closer than some like. So I'm actually looking forward to your podcast at the 33rd team on that one. I just think it's an interesting one, and I think that when we look for fantasy points, oftentimes if we can just find really consolidated offenses touch-wise, then those guys can beat expectations. So I have been trying to take a couple of shots here, especially on underdog. I love that Chicago, Atlanta, combining that game when I can and trying to have at least 2 Atlanta Falcons. That's interesting. And do you think that Ritter does enough this year to kind of hold on to his job for next year?
No, I don't think so. I think it's pretty unlikely Ritter is the starting quarterback for A, all of this season, and B, into next season. Taylor Heineke already unseated Carson Wentz, and I think that was a tougher hill in many ways to climb than Desmond Ridder, given Ritter's draft capital, skill set, etc. So I'm pretty pessimistic about Ridder. I think what's probably going to happen is this will be a pretty good offense. And I think people are going to look and say, you know what, it looks like Ritter's holding them back. A good example, I guess a parallel for people being like, what do you mean a functional offense and the quarterback gets toasted? We kind of saw this with the 49ers. Jimmy Garoppolo was always averaging about as many yards per pass attempt as Mahomes whenever he played for the Niners. I'm not kidding. Always around 8 or more yards per attempt because of that system. And what did they do? They went after and traded up for Trey Lance. Obviously, that hasn't really worked out, but it's the idea that this is what teams do. If you realize that your quarterback is holding back the offense, even if their stats look okay on the face value, you're probably going to do your very best to upgrade there. We've seen Matthew Stafford, Deshaun Watson, Russell Wilson. Teams have been very aggressive trying to get the right quarterback. Obviously, it doesn't always work, but hey, in the case of Stafford, the Rams won a Super Bowl in their first year with him. And I think that kind of showed the importance of not being complacent. Jared Goff was not a bad NFL quarterback. The Rams just said, you know what, Stafford is better. And sure enough, he was in fact better. So I think Ridder is probably in some type of situation where he will not be starting next year.
That's probably the safe money bet right there. I want to touch on another subject. Right now, Travis Kelce is the clear tight end 1 overall. It's not even close. And Patrick Mahomes is generally the QB1. You see some drafters starting with Hurts or Allen, but almost most drafts, it's Patrick Mahomes. You also have the opportunity in most formats, and NFFC is different. Patrick Mahomes has been steamed up with the 6-point passing touchdowns. But in underdog and also in FFPC, you're seeing a lot of Mahomes Kelce stacks. It sounds great. And last year, this worked out well when Mahomes was going off the board later. But now when you have to use this sort of draft capital, is this a poor approach? Do you think that the opportunity cost of having QB1 and tight end 1 overall is kind of brought down by the fact that you're passing up on so many potential league winners at wide receiver and at running back? You could take it from best ball. You can take it from redraft, Josh, but I think it's a conversation to have.
So the way I see it is, let's say that you start your first 2 picks with a tight end and a quarterback in Kelce and Mahomes. You could very well have the tight end 1 and QB1 at their positions, but you're really going to have to nail the running back and receivers pretty perfectly. In a 12-team league, best ball or redraft, if it's just purely a 12-team league, that's not a bet that I'm very excited to make. However, in a tournament where you're really trying to have these ceiling outcomes, I'm more willing then to say, you know what? Let's hope that Mahomes and Kelce distance themselves at their respective positions and have a really big week 15, 16, 17. And then I'm going to hit the nuts with some of these running backs and receivers that I take in rounds 3 through 7. So that's kind of how I'm viewing it right now. Is it's agreed. Much easier to go Kelce round 1, Mahomes round 4, round 5 last year than it is to get Mahomes in the second this year. So for me, 12-team regular league, uninterested. Tournaments, I still think that that's a viable start.
I just always think back to 2020 where, the most common start in FFPC drafts was, when you got the 1, you'd see Christian McCaffrey go with the 1, and then you would see a Mark Andrews and Lamar Jackson combination of somehow, and those teams all flopped out. I just think when it gets to be this much draft capital put into a stack and this common a stack, I think that it gets to be very difficult for this one to really pay off. I think that there's certain situations where it will, if you're an excellent drafter and you're able to extract value and really nail rounds 3, 4, 5, 6, then I think this works out well. But I do think that you're really almost trying to thread the needle, even though it seems like the low-hanging fruit. And I think that a lot of people would push back with me on that one, but I'm going to avoid stack number 1 a lot in redraft. But Josh, I do have a bunch of Kelce Mahomes underdog teams because you got to have a couple if you're going for that big prize, because you don't want to not have it if everybody else is doing it, right?
That's kind of how I view it, is that at the very least, it's kind of a weird thing to totally fade in a big tournament when you're chasing ceiling outcomes. Say, I don't like the best quarterback tight end duo in history, especially when you look at how Kelce scores compared to other guys. But I agree with you. It's like I said, it's not a bet that I'm trying to make in these normal 12-team leagues. I think it's pretty much tournament specific at this point.
So we have a clear hierarchy developing at the wide receiver position. You have Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase. We talked about this when you came on First Class Fantasy. This is more of a conversation than I think a lot want to admit, but those are your top two. Tyreek Hill, for the most part, is wide receiver 3 overall. Fantastic season last year, 119 receptions, 170 targets. Unbelievable how good that Miami offense was for him and Waddle. Cooper Kupp settled in at the 4 spot. Then when we get to wide receiver 5, you have a little bit of a conversation. Are you on Stephon Diggs or CeeDee Lamb, or is there another wide receiver you want to push up to wide receiver 5 overall?
So I think these should be the next two guys. I leaned Stephon Diggs. I leaned Lamb earlier in the offseason, kind of thinking Bills would really add somebody, and then they just kind of didn't. They drafted a tight end. And ultimately, if we just look at Stephon Diggs, he's averaged in 3 years with Buffalo. These are real stats. He has averaged in 3 years 161 targets, 113 receptions, 1,396 yards, and 10 touchdowns per season. You want to look at his lows? These are just grabbing the lows in each of those categories. At least 154 targets, at least 103 receptions, at least 1,225 yards, and at least 8 touchdowns. There's minimal true target competition. It's still Gabe Davis, Dawson Knox, Dalton Kincaid. There's just nobody there that looks like they're going to take Diggs' lunch money. CeeDee Lamb now has Brandon Cooks, who I think is still probably at least a half decent starting receiver in the NFL. Michael Gallup's now another year removed from the ACL tear. And as we mentioned before, they lost their offensive coordinator, Kellen Moore, to the Chargers. Kellen Moore being ousted was one of the weirdest moves of the offseason. All he did was lead the number 1 and then number 4 scoring offenses in the NFL the past 2 seasons. That to me does not sound like the guy that you should kick out. So because of all those reasons, I think it's still Diggs over Lamb.
Yeah, the Kellen Moore thing is like an all-timer for Dallas. You keep Mike McCarthy, you get rid of Kellen Moore. I think in a couple of years that's going to be comical. Wanted to kind of pick your brain here. We also see a group of elevated wide receiver 2s. We agree these guys are all studs. Devonta Smith, T. Higgins, Jalen Waddle. But which of these 3 has the best chance to lead their respective teams in PPR points? Because right now, like, you can make a case they all make sense where they're being drafted structurally. But if these guys are going to be league winners, at least one of them needs to potentially flip the script.
So I think in terms of in a vacuum, who's probably the most likely to lead their team in scoring, I'd say it's probably Devonta Smith, just because of how close he and A.J. Brown were in many ways. That being said, I think the best value is Jalen Waddle. And it's just because this Miami offense is literally just Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. In Philadelphia, you don't just have A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith. You have Dallas Goedert. You have Jalen Hurts, who is kind of his own offensive weapon in his own right. They have DeAndre Swift, who's now there. There's just a lot going on with the Eagles to make me think it's likely less consolidated than the Dolphins. So I think let's just say that Tyreek Hill, A.J. Brown, and Jamar Chase go down. I'd actually probably give Waddle that biggest boost as well. He had the rookie receptions record in 2021. We know this guy can handle being the focal point of a pass attack. As a rookie, he was the low average depth of target, high volume player. In year 2, he was the high depth of target, lower volume player. He crushed in both roles. He's just so unbelievably versatile with the game-breaking speed that Smith and Higgins don't have. So I would lean Waddle as the best value, even if I think Devonta Smith is closest to his counterpart, A.J. Brown, in terms of how they're probably going to finish.
Yeah, I think you nailed that one, and I think that like in terms of contingent upside, it's definitely Waddle, because if Tyreek Hill missed time, Jalen Waddle could be like a 13 target a game guy. It could just be explosive, and I love how you bring up the fact that he won multiple ways. He's also been an ADP beater for back-to-back seasons. So this could be three years in a row. I think he could return first round value as well. I wanted to stick with this wide receiver discussion. I've coined the term the money zone. Okay, this back-to-back years I've tweeted about this, where we've seen a ton of huge wins at ADP from the very end of the wide receiver 2s down to the wide receiver 4s. I think a lot of times you see wide receivers get pushed up into that wide receiver 2 range, the high wide receiver 2s, and you see some ADP misses. Last year, Cortland Sutton, Gabe Davis, Brandon Cooks, Allen Robinson, a number of guys really failed in that range, whereas guys behind them really hit. Devonta Smith, who you talked about before, Amari Cooper, Tyler Lockett, Christian Kirk were all ADP smashes right in this range of high-end wide receiver 3s down to the wide receiver 4s. Which wide receiver 3s and 4s have league-winning upside right now, Josh, or just potential to get into the top 15 scorers at the wide receiver position?
So we hinted on him earlier in the show. So there's Kadarius Toney. I mean, of course, we have to mention him. If he stays healthy and runs 60, 70% of the routes, this is a pretty obvious wide receiver 1 candidate. Dangerous after the catch, always highly targeted per route, a good route runner on a great offense. There's been rumors that the Chiefs will expand his route tree heading into year 2 with them, where he will be less limited to the short part of the field and run a little bit farther down the field, which we like to see. But I'll give you 2 names where we don't just have to be like, oh, like fingers crossed for health, when I think we all realize there's a reason Toney goes where he does. This has to be the most brittle receiver in football. One of those names, so stinky offense, there's quarterback uncertainty, but I love Marquise Brown. There's no target competition. This Arizona defense is not going to be stopping anybody. Marquise Brown was wide receiver 7 per game through 6 weeks last year, over 18 PPR points a game before injury and before DeAndre Hopkins returned from suspension. Newsflash, Hopkins is not on this team anymore. He's currently floating around. That's good for Marquise Brown. Marquise Brown through those 6 weeks averaged nearly 11 targets, over 7 receptions, 81 receiving yards, and half a touchdown per game, which is pacing for 122 receptions and nearly 1,400 yards over 17 games. I don't understand why his ADP is so low. I get that it's a bad offense with quarterback uncertainty, but there's just no target competition. And also, Kyler Murray will be back at the end of the season. So when all the money is won in fantasy, Marquise Brown, who should be quite good early in the season, then just gets that extra boost of getting Kyler back to end the season. And I've got one more name in this realm where it's not just a Toney, cross your fingers for health. This is a player, he just had career highs across the board last year, 114 targets, 78 receptions, 1,015 receiving yards, and 8 touchdowns. That sounds like a pretty great season from Brandon Ayuk. His pace with Brock Purdy in those final 6 regular season games was basically the same as that full season pace. He's kind of quietly this number 1 receiver in San Francisco. And this is a team with potential to be near the top of the league in scoring. So I'm naturally going to want the number 1 receiving option in that offense. And I believe it is Brandon Ayuk.
I love the Ayuk one. And I think that the teammate arbitrage is a great way of finding value in this zone of wide receivers. That's where the historical winners have been, Jamar Chase going behind T. Higgins. We don't want to get too greedy, but Cooper Kupp was getting drafted behind Robert Woods. And I love your Hollywood Brown one because we've seen every single year the perception of a bad offense pushing down a wide receiver 1. The clear number 1 target in a bad offense, Josh, if you're getting 30% target share, your offense can be pretty bad and you're still going to be putting up fantasy numbers. 2021 Brandon Cooks, a nice archetype for that. Want to quickly just pick your brain. Are you in or out on ADP on Treylon Burks?
Treylon Burks, I'm kind of with ADP. Maybe
Okay.
I'd lean over just because he's a young player who's the obvious receiver 1 in that offense. It's just not an offense that looks like the type that will produce a top 12 receiver. That's an article that I'm going to write for the 33rd team is essentially what do we need to get this top 12 receiver? Because we shouldn't really be drafting guys that we think have no shot at that truly elite range of outcomes. That's just not how you should probably be playing fantasy football with your first 6, 7 picks. So Burks has a hard time to get there, but he looks like he has an easy time to beat ADP. So I'll kind of be breaking him down more in depth as to why he's not a bad pick, but that this is kind of almost a floor pick, as weird as that sounds for his profile.
Yeah, I think that that's a good way of looking at it. It's a structural floor pick, and I always say that he's got top 18 upside, but I guess that's kind of a purgatory thing all in itself with how wide receiver scoring is a little flatter than people think. And one guy that really smashed in his career, and now he's being drafted in the 7th round, is Mike Evans. Do you see him as a guy that could beat ADP here? I've started to like Mike Evans a little bit more and more the more beat up he gets.
Yeah, I'm starting to like him more as the ADP keeps dropping. But ultimately, this Buccaneers offense doesn't look like one that's going to produce a ton of fantasy points. And Mike Evans' peripherals are actually just kind of average. He's flirting with around a 20% target share, which, of course, if you play with Tom Brady, that's a ton of targets. Tom Brady's led the NFL in pass attempts in 2 straight seasons by a considerable margin. So if you're looking at a guy that maybe gets around 20% of the targets in a Baker Mayfield offense, that starts to look a lot like the lesser version of those Odell Beckham and Cleveland seasons. And then I start to get less excited. So I think he has a pretty good chance at beating his ADP. I just don't really see the ceiling with him. So I think I'd prefer Burks to Evans as of right now.
Want to pivot over to the tight end position. This is like tight end. There's no variance. It is what it is. Guys go where they go. You hardly ever see reaching. FFPC drafts right now, which is a 1.5 tight end scoring for PPR, tight end premium. Kelce's a round 1 lock. You see him occasionally go like 2 overall, always in the top 5. Mark Andrews, like we talked about, goes by the middle of the 2nd round. TJ Hawkinson has settled in the 3rd round, occasionally gets dragged into the 2nd. Then you see 4th round is George Kittle and Kyle Pitts. Maybe you get lucky, one of them falls to the 5th round. And then the 5th or the 6th round, it's almost bang picks with Darren Waller and Dallas Goedert, with Waller going ahead of him usually. And then you drop 25 whole spots, Josh, and you're at the Engram, Freiermuth, David Njoku tier. And that's pretty much every single draft. Who is the best value of the players that I listed?
I'd say the best value is Darren Waller. Darren Waller is the clear top receiving option for the Giants. They actually scored the 15th most offensive points last year out of 32 teams. That's above average. That was with no receivers. Their receiver room's still not great, but it's very deep, so that raises the floor. Yet you look at these receivers and you go, well, none of these guys looks at all like a healthy Darren Waller. So if he's healthy, I think he puts up difference-making fantasy production. I think he actually has a real case to be the tight end 2 overall in fantasy when all is said and done, but he's going to go so much later than some of those other guys like Kelce, Andrews, Hawkinson. So for me, Darren Waller, the guy who had back-to-back seasons with at least 90 receptions, at least 1,145 yards, and in both those seasons, 2019 and 2020, he would have been the tight end 2 in fantasy in 2022, behind only Travis Kelce. I understand there's been 2 injury-filled seasons, but again, it's tight end. It's the NFL. This happens. I don't see any reason why Waller cannot return to form with what should be a competent quarterback, a great offensive mind in Brian Daboll, who came over to the Giants from the Bills last year, and again, just a receiver depth chart of fine, competent players, but nobody that looks like they can take Waller's targets away from him.
I love the Waller answer, and Sigmund Bluma actually had this last week here on press coverage where, he's all about Waller. He also likes Pitts a lot, but, we're trying to look for tight ends who can lead their teams in targets to have that truly elite upside, and Waller's it. And Brian Daboll, I'm also very curious because Brian Daboll's never had a move tight end like this where he's going to line the guy up all over the field. And I'm not saying this is what's going to happen, but I remember the market was kind of neutral on Stephon Diggs when he first arrived in Buffalo in that Daboll offense. Daboll designed the whole scheme for him and was able to really rejuvenate him. Stephon Diggs was going in about the same range in FFPC drafts as Waller is right now. I don't think that sort of like league winning upside is there, but I do think Waller could be a guy that could be a 15-point per game tight end scorer, which is absolutely impactful in this tight end premium type environment. And wanted to quickly pick your brain of the players I didn't list, or you could talk about this like the last tier here, Josh, but kind of off the grain, who would be your bet to finish top 3 at the tight end position in scoring? A real dark horse, or simply, the Engram, Freiermuth, and Njoku tier is absolutely in play for this answer as well?
I'll give you 2 late guys. I don't know if they're going to finish quite at tight end 3, but where I think they can kind of thrust themselves into this conversation. One of them is Greg Dulcich, the Broncos tight end. He had a 17% rookie year target share. Pitts was around 20% as a rookie, so that's actually pretty close. Greg Dulcich was one of 4 tight ends last year with multiple games of at least 80 receiving yards. 80 receiving yards, that's a lot for a tight end. He only played in 10 games as a rookie due to injury. So I think there's real upside here with Sean Payton, now the head coach of the Broncos. We could see Russell Wilson turn it around. And after Jerry Jeudy, there's not really any serious target earners in this offense, potentially, aside from Jeudy and Dulcich. So that 1-2 punch could be very nice. The other guy would be Tyler Conklin of the New York Jets. There are no target hogs in New York after Garrett Wilson. Alan Lazard, not a target hog. Who knows what's happening with Corey Davis, Mecole Hardman, certified gadget player. There's a lot of targets coming from Aaron Rodgers, and I think Conklin can get a lot of them. At least 58 catches, at least 552 receiving yards the past 2 seasons. If that bumps up like low 60s for his receptions, 650 to 700 yards where he's getting a little bit more accurate targets, he can get down the field a little more because he is pretty athletic. Suddenly you're like, wow, 64 catches, 700 yards, 8 touchdowns from Aaron Rodgers. That in some years can be the tight end 3 or tight end 4. So Tyler Conklin's my pick, possibly the best tight end that Rodgers has ever played with.
Yeah, I like that selection a lot. Dulcich is interesting, and I think that the Chiga Okonkwo, Dalton Kincaid, Dulcich tier is interesting, in terms of like potential upside going in a little bit later rounds. And they've all kind of a little bit of more affordable than you would think, for the potential upside they have. Because I think a lot of people are kind of avoid, that mid-tier tight end in general. So you might be able to find, value from there. I like Freiermuth a lot. He had nearly 100 targets last year. And I think we're chasing a lot of Deontay Johnson positive regression. It could just be Pat Freiermuth gets the touchdowns like he did his rookie season as Pittsburgh gets a little bit better. And then all of a sudden you're talking about a top 5 scoring tight end this year as well, only entering year 3. We've gone so long here. We're already at 45 minutes. So I want to really get into this. One of the reasons I wanted to have you on, Josh, is I think you're very good at discussing dead zone running backs. The dead zone, you did extensive research when you were at Player Profiler. You had some great takeaways, such as targeting younger players with pass catching upside in the dead zone. That's great. I agree with you. However, the dead zone has been turned upside down. We see running back 10 was going like 13th overall in 2018. Running back 10 was going like 18th overall last year. Now running back 10 in a regular FFPC or underdog draft, expect them to go off the board like 26th or 27th. It's also the case with running back 5. Running back 5 has seen the same dramatic shift. Basically, you have seen a de-emphasis of the non-top 5, let's call them truly elite running back scorers. These guys have gotten pushed down, and wide receiver has gotten pushed up. This year, you also have the double-edged sword of the big 3 quarterbacks getting pushed up. So running back keeps falling and falling. I want to see what you make of the new running back landscape and kind of how you see it from a macro perspective. Is the market just suddenly became correct, or is this an overcorrection?
So typically the dead zone in prior years, before everyone talked about the dead zone and kind of changed the dead zone, as you mentioned, was like that late round 3, early round 4 through like the round 6 running backs. These were all do not draft. These guys were expensive. And yeah, there were a lot of really bad picks there, like Mike Davis on the Falcons, like dusty old David Johnson, who was supposedly going to be the starter for one more year. You got a lot of players like that. We don't get as many players like that anymore. I'll tell you where I think the dead zone potentially can begin. And there's 2 names that really come to mind where I think there's a lot of red flags surrounding them. One of them is Joe Mixon. He's often going in the 4th, 5th round. And he's one of these guys where the dead zone back is like guaranteed volume. Oh, there's guaranteed volume in this good Bengals offense. I actually don't even know who it is. They're probably going to sign someone or something's going to happen. But Mixon was outsnapped in 2 of those 3 playoff games by Samaje Perine. I understand they let Perine go, but it's hard to look at that depth chart where they never let Chris Evans play. They never let Travion Williams play. Chase Brown is a pretty unproven 5th round rookie running back who didn't have stiff college competition. This does not feel like a complete running back room. Mixon, I understand, had great pass volume in the receiving game last year, but all of his rushing stats were horribly inefficient. And the team even thought the backup should play more in the playoffs. So I think he starts to become a little bit concerning, where it's like, it's just guaranteed volume based on this depth chart today. The other guy that I think is concerning would be Aaron Jones. There's not much of a goal line role, most likely. I tweeted this very controversial thing out that I thought was hilarious because of how people just kind of put their heads in the sand when they saw it. I just tweeted out the Green Bay rushing touchdowns last year. A.J. Dillon led the team with 7. Christian Watson was second with 2. And Aaron Jones was tied with Christian Watson for 2. And I was like, guys, there's probably not a lot of goal line carries for him. He's never been a big rush volume guy. The pass game role is going to get shakier because you go from Aaron Rodgers to Jordan Love. Jordan Love's a little bit more of a mobile, younger play extender. And this pass game has better weapons than it did in recent years. Not only do we have breakout Christian Watson from last year, but they drafted Jaden Reed at receiver and Luke Musgrave at tight end in round 2. Suddenly there's 3 pass catchers over the last 2 years with round 2 draft capital, and Jordan Love and AJ Dillon. I start to really struggle to see where this like ultra fruitful fantasy relevant role is for Jones. And knowing that every running back is an injury concern, if I can't squint and see the elite upside, I'm probably not going to draft a whole lot of them in fantasy football.
I think it's interesting, and I'll push back a little bit where Mixon did have his career high in terms of catches. So that could become something that could keep him afloat. Jones obviously has some pass catching ability as well. But I think like things change, but things still stay the same. You've identified 2 older running backs who have probably had their best fantasy seasons. So basically, we can kind of be in agreement. I think that the 3rd round backs all have, potential big time upside. You talk about the Breece Halls, the Stevensons, Pollard's a 2nd rounder at this point. But I think the Gibbs, even Najee Harris, they are there for a reason. But when we get to that 4th round, I think the 4th round is the new dead zone and when you need to start treating it as such. How about running back 14, Travis Etienne, a guy who this was the kind of guy when he was, a rookie that you were looking at as, a dead zone beater, but the pass catching just has not been there as a pro. Is he a dead zone back for you, or is he one that's a little bit live?
I would say he's a dead zone back. He's a pretty phenomenal rusher. There were like next gen stats, I believe it was, had him like borderline Nick Chubb for how he was doing per carry last year. Very explosive runner on a great offense. I don't think there's much risk of him losing his job, being that they pretty much just got rid of James Robinson and gave Etienne all the work. There's new 3rd round running back Tank Bigsby there, but I don't think there's anything Bigsby does as well as Etienne. And I think that's very important for the dead zone is you always want these running backs that are kind of there by merit, have the draft capital like Etienne does. And the Jacksonville receivers, this was my good friend and coworker Jordan Vanek pointed this out. He said, those Jacksonville receivers stayed crazily healthy last year. Kirk never really missed time. Zay Jones never missed time. Evan Engram didn't miss time. I know Calvin Ridley's there, but still, it was the picture of health. So it does make sense why they wouldn't necessarily need to use Etienne as much in the receiving game. So I think that receiving upside is still there because we know Lawrence and Etienne have had massive receiving seasons put together where Etienne's final 2 years in college at Clemson with Lawrence, he had over 1,000 receiving yards in that 2-year span. So the receiving, I think it's still there. It's dormant currently, but I think it definitely can come out at this point. So I would not say Etienne is a dead zone back.
I think what's interesting is the Doug Peterson year 2, potentially he mixes it up a little more and does target the running backs as just a wrinkle because they were so wide receiver heavy last year and so tight end dependent. And so, one thing that Trevor Lawrence was very good at was checking down to Etienne in college. Maybe we see that as Etienne becomes a little bit more comfortable as a pro and with the offense. So I think that's interesting. So we don't need to dive into it, but I think round 5, the Walker, Dobbins, Akers tier, that's an appealing tier to me. Are you in on these guys just from a step back level, or do you find some concern with this tier of running backs?
I see the case for Dobbins and Akers. Kenneth Walker, I'm starting to have a harder time. I know my coworker Ryan Reynolds is quite high on Walker. I've been a little bit concerned. I just struggle to see what he definitively does better than Zach Charbonnet outside of being fast. So I think there's a little concern there. I haven't totally faded him because it's still someone that was very productive in his rookie year, entering year 2, round 2 draft capital, good offensive line, good offensive environment. He is fast, as I mentioned. But I do think there's a lot of paths for Kenneth Walker to fail in fantasy that I don't think Dobbins and Akers have quite as many of those at this point. So I'd lean Dobbins, then Akers, then Walker if we're looking at those 3 in that tier.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. And I think that Walker, when he gets to the 6th round, I've pulled the trigger a couple times. I do have concerns. I love Zach Charbonnet coming out of school. and I think he's a complete back. But I do think that being a home run hitter is not always a bad thing when we're talking about our RB2 in terms of potentially game-winning weeks. So I'm not completely out on Walker. Now we get to the real dead zone. This is like the traditional dead zone. But now, Josh, you're talking about the end of round 5, usually round 6 through round 7. Alexander Mattison, Miles Sanders, Damian Pierce, Rashad White, David Montgomery, DeAndre Swift, Dalvin Cook, James Conner, and then the Pacheco, Javonte Williams, James Cook guys. Those guys you can sometimes get in round 8. Sometimes they creep into round 7. This is the real dead zone, right, Josh? This is like no bones about it, but now it's later, right?
Yeah, so there's some of these backs I like, some I don't like. The most obvious ones I don't like, Alexander Mattison is just like such a dead zone back. He's never reached 500 rushing yards in any of his 4 NFL seasons. People say, oh, he was behind Dalvin Cook. You know what? Backup running backs are pretty cheap.
And Josh, how many carries did he have last year? It was like people talk about how he's got 250 carries. You're asking him to triple up the carries plus.
Yeah, he needs like this monumental increase in work. The Vikings have said many times that if Madison is their opening day starter, it's going to be a full-blown committee. They haven't been shy about that. And why would they? I think the fantasy community is really the only people out there that are like, oh, Madison's going to get 300 touches, gift wrapped to him. That's not really how it works. And Madison signed this 2-year, $7 million deal. That's backup running back money. It just seems like there have been so many chances for another team to look at Madison and go, oh, that is a capable starter. Let's sign him as our starter. Nobody has ever done that. The Vikings did not do that. They drafted him and gave him a very obvious committee back salary. He's not fast. He's kind of fine, but not great anywhere. Dead zone back. Another guy I'll mention, James Cook really feels like a dead zone back. I think he's pretty unlikely to get the large goal line role because of his size. And then there's Damien Harris that they signed, who had, I think, 15 rushing touchdowns 2 years ago. Josh Allen, as we know, is always a red zone goal line type threat. And if you're not going to get a lot of goal line work and you're small and you're probably not going to get a lot of carries, then we hope it comes in the pass game. And, James Cook, under a 6% target share as a rookie with an average depth of target under 2 yards, which is very low. So he's not running like Austin Ekeler type borderline receiver routes. He's just catching some dump offs. We know Josh Allen doesn't dump off very much. Very, very hard for me to see how James Cook improves at the goal line and receiving and suddenly bulks up to handle more carries. I think all we're doing is looking at Bill's running back and just assuming he's going to be awesome. So James Cook is somebody that I have almost zero exposure to, despite loving the offense overall.
So I have taken a good amount of James Cook in the 8th round. I'll push back. I think that this is a polarizing one, Josh, because like you're with Matt Kelly is with you completely, and then Mike Shope, who I think is probably my most respected Bills guy, around from the deep end, and also does local radio up in Buffalo for them. He's on Damien Harris' side too. So I'm on the James Cook side with Memphis Young of the Dynasty Warzone. I think James Cook absorbs the Devin Singletary role, and I think he's an explosive running back. Damien Harris has also been a guy that struggled to stay healthy. And I think that chasing the Bills running back position is not the worst strategy going, because we've seen ADP wins last year, not as much, but the year before, Devin Singletary was going, in a similar range. You had a Zach Moss, Devin Singletary, argument. And then we saw Devin Singletary down the stretch really help us a lot. So we can bump heads a little bit on this one, but I'm with you on the rest. Wanted to kind of pick your brain a little bit more, because last year the running back threes just crushed. Tony Pollard, Ramondre Stevenson, Josh Jacobs was a running back 3 in a lot of August and September drafts, especially in high stakes. And if he was an RB2, he was like RB23, RB24. And then Miles Sanders was like a forgotten man. All of these guys returned top 15 production at the position. Is there an RB3 that you see that could really, really flip leagues upside down and return like top 15, potentially RB1 scoring numbers?
So the guy I'm most confident in, he is a high-end RB3. It's kind of like Josh Jacobs, but he is in this RB3 range. He does go in generally 7th, 8th, 9th round of fantasy drafts. This is probably going to be my running back flag plant for 2023. This guy's been in the league for 4 seasons. He's averaged 229 carries, 39 receptions, over 1,200 yards, and 7.5 touchdowns per season, with at least 235 touches each of those seasons. This is a durable guy. He just got signed to a 3-year deal with $11 million in guarantees. That's a big investment. Yes, he's playing alongside a rookie, but the rookie that he plays alongside is 25 pounds lighter than David Montgomery, making David Montgomery almost certainly the favorite for goal line work. How are we not excited about David Montgomery when he's playing behind a top offensive line, the number 5 overall scoring offense from last year? The team that had the most PPR fantasy points at running back last year was the Detroit Lions. Jahmyr Gibbs is awesome. He's better than David Montgomery, and he's also 199 pounds. And for those of you that think there's 300 touches to go around in a running back room, you are sadly mistaken. There's usually about 500. I don't think Jahmyr Gibbs is going to get more than 200 to 225 touches his rookie season, leaving a ton of room for David Montgomery. I think David Montgomery gives you RB2 production each week. And any week that Jahmyr Gibbs misses due to injury or is just not as much a part of the game plan, David Montgomery is a top 8 fantasy running back in those weeks. So the floor for Montgomery is better than where he's getting drafted, and he has the league-winning ceiling, the best offensive line of his career, the best overall offensive environment, the best play calling. This is a good running back. And I just think people have been very bored with it. Round 3, round 4, David Montgomery. And for some reason, they're not in on round 8, David Montgomery, in a much better situation. I absolutely love him. He's my favorite dynasty buy, and he's currently my highest exposure running back in all of these best ball drafts.
I love it, Josh. And we had Sigmund Bloom on last week, and he talked about how he likes Gibbs and Montgomery a lot. And I think that there's a situation where Ben Johnson maximizes his talent. You have Amon-Ra St. Brown. You have Jameson Williams, who is now missing the start of the season. You have a rookie tight end. I think his best second and third best weapons are going to be running back and running back. And I think Gibbs is going to catch an absolute ton of balls. But I do agree with you. David Montgomery has big-time touchdown equity in his range of outcomes. And last year was his highest yards per reception season. So if Gibbs does miss time, I agree with you. He's potentially a league winner in that offense. Josh, you were awesome. Super generous with your time. Give me one handcuff running back that you are really liking to draft. And David Montgomery doesn't count.
No, he doesn't count. So I think what we have to do here is you always want to look at who the shiny new toy, the sexy early running backs are, because people hate to imagine this guy underperforming or getting injured. And I think Bijan Robinson is the absolute sexiest shiny new toy, the golden boy. So I really like Tyler Algier. The guy had 1,200 yards as a rookie, 5th round pick against all odds. He's pretty good at football. Should anything happen to Bijan Robinson, I think Algier gives you nearly the same fantasy production, and he is not even one of the earliest handcuffs off the board. It makes no sense.
Well, that one hurts a lot, Josh. I don't want to even think about Bijan Robinson missing any time. Let everybody know where they can find your work.
You can find all of my work on the33rdteam.com. You can find me on Twitter at JLarkyTweets. Theo, thanks for, we'll just call this episode 12 that we've podcasted together. Another really fun show with you.
Just a shout out to Matt Kelly, the Podfather. I'm going to start labeling the episodes with my episode count, and I'm also going to do my Josh Larky total running count in the show notes. Everybody, thanks for joining us. Make sure you tune in. We have Stack Hunters with Bradley Stalder, our new best ball show. That's Tuesday night. That's tomorrow evening. That's going to be a really, really cool one. Bradley's done a lot of great best ball work for us, and this is going to be no doubt continuing. Very, very sharp guy. He's got some great stuff coming along. And then tune in Thursday. I will be back right here on YouTube, and you can find me for First Class Fantasy. I'm going to have Chris Vaccaro and Nando DeFino, both of The Athletic, both really, really sharp guys. We're going to talk a little bit of high stakes. And tune in next week. We're going to have another press coverage as well. Josh, thanks a lot for your time. This was awesome, man. I really, really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Hey, I want to take a moment to thank you for tuning in. It's important to me that all of our media be free. This is only possible because of you allowing a true independent sports media enterprise to thrive unlike any other in the business. So please subscribe to the All In Package to continue to make all of this possible, to ensure that all of our stats, information, data, content is available to you especially you, the people that get the site and get the show.